Hey, this is Ruth Apollonia. If you are interested in the writing history of the Annabelle of Anchony series and the struggle I went through creating it, stick around because that's what I'm going to talk about today. Okay, so a little background information. When I was in high school, I started watching the Love Comes Softly movies that were on the Hallmark Channel and realized that they came from a series of books that were written by Jeanette Oke. So the movies actually made me interested in the books. So I checked out basically all of her books from the library and read them all. And they were the first books that I read that actually incorporated faith into the book. So I'm really thankful for that, getting that awareness of how that can be done. At the same time, they didn't have the sacraments in there, and so to me it was Protestant because it didn't have any of the sacraments. And once the characters came to know Christ, the story was over and they lived happily ever after. And I'm like, well, that's not true. I mean, we have reconciliation for a reason, right? But that's kind of where what was first planted in my mind, that faith can be incorporated into books, was when I was in high school. So then fast forward to, as I had said in my other video, which I will link below, that it was 2006, 2007, when I was in college and going through the occupational therapy program, that I started writing Annabelle's story, and I was handwriting it. So what was going on at that time? So that was the time when the Harry Potter books were being made into movies and the Da Vinci Code had just come out. I haven't read any of them, so I can't comment specifically on them, but I think we can say that there was some kind of controversy out there about the books potentially leading people away from the faith, especially the Da Vinci Code book. So I heard that talk of books that were leading people, that could potentially lead people away from Christ, as I'm pretty certain the Da Vinci Code kind of did make people think that Christ wasn't divine. So I got to thinking, why couldn't there be a book that actually taught the faith, specifically the Catholic faith, and could pass it on and could actually make someone grow closer to Christ, touch them so that he's not just in their mind but in their heart as well. So that was kind of in my mind, and so I was like, well, what situation would a character be in where, like, that's all she had to do was to learn faith? And so that's kind of how Annabelle ended up on an island. And then, of course, there had to be someone there who could teach her. So that's how Peter got there. And then, the plot just kind of went on from there, because it was like, okay, well, what else could she learn while being on this island? And then, so in general, when I first started, I basically knew that Annabelle was going to be on the island, and then eventually she was going to get off, and she was going to find her family again. So that was the very bare bones of the plot that I had when I first started. And I'll just take a moment right here and explain something that was explained to me by the Catholic Writers Guild going to the conferences. So they say there's two types of writers. So there's the outliner, who outlines everything, and then there is the seat of the pantsers, who just do it as it comes, do it by the seat of the pants. And that's what I am. I'm a panter. And especially in the beginning. So what I would do is I would write a scene, and then I would write another scene, and then eventually I would have to try to get them to come together and to mesh. So in the process, I wasted like a lot of time, a lot of paper, but I also got to know who my characters were that way. And so I just wanted to show you, since I've been saying that I was handwriting things, that I'm very serious here. I was handwriting. So so let me show you here. So for the first book, this is the size it came out to be. So it is 367 pages. Okay, 367 pages in book format. I would say that I probably actually wrote like twice that amount in the process of writing Annabelle's story. So there is a whole lot of stuff that I wrote that didn't make it into the book. But like I said, during that process, even though the plot was going all over the place and wasn't, really going where it was supposed to be, I was learning who the characters were and how they were going to be. And so it's a very interesting process. And so, some people might be like, oh, well, you wasted a lot of time, a lot of paper, that kind of stuff. But as I said before, I was just doing it for me. At this point, I wasn't trying to publish anything. I was just creating a story that I would want to write. And so I don't regret any of this. I mean, it helped me to make Annabelle become who she is today. Once I got a computer and actually started to type, I should say once I got like my own laptop and started to type, there is also additional stuff on there that I would type and ended up not using in the actual book that I turned in. So it's a process, and during the process, I started realizing that it was kind of good, and I wanted it to be the best. And so I was praying that God would inspire me, that the Holy Spirit would inspire me. And so looking back now, there was a certain spot. So for those of you that have not read the book, I'm going to try to keep this as general so that there's no spoilers. But that hopefully those that have read the book will kind of know what I'm talking about. So at the point in the book when Annabelle meets her family, what I had initially typed was I had like 30 pages that I had typed in Microsoft Word, and then something happened and I couldn't open it. So basically I lost all those 30 pages. And at that point I was like, well, I guess God doesn't want that. Doesn't want it to be that way, so I will come up with something else. So it's a process of trusting in God. That actually reminds me of the very first scene that I actually hand wrote was, okay, so this is going to sound a little odd because I just said that scene was when she met her family. So this scene was when she met her father, when Annabelle met her father. And it was a scene that now, it didn't really fit into the plot as the plot developed, but since it was the very first thing that I wrote, I didn't have the heart not to get rid of it. So what I did was I added it in as a dream that Annabelle has. So the scene in the first book, and I believe the chapter is called Dreams. So that chapter, that dream that she has, was actually what I first wrote, was that moment when she met her father. I had to tweak it so that it fit into the plot as it was and as a dream and that kind of stuff. But that's actually where that comes from. Is it was the very first thing that I wrote, and I couldn't take it out because, you know, that's, even though it didn't fit into the plot anymore as it was, that's where that came from. And so I just wanted to keep it in there. So when I first turned in my manuscript to the first publisher and the editor got a hold of it, again, I'm going to keep this vague for those that have not read it and try to explain it the best I can without giving anything away. So the person who ends up being not who he's supposed to be was actually in my first draft that I gave to them. He was who he was supposed to be. And it was actually through the process of editing that it changed. And it was literally as I was on the phone with the editor, she was saying, why would her dad allow this person? And that's as far as I'm going to say so that I don't ruin anything. Right, so I was on the phone with the editor and she was asking me this question, and it was, honestly, it was like it was a revelation to myself. And I was like, because it's not really him. And she was like, oh, okay. You know? And then that basically became the plot of my second book, was trying to find the real him. So it's a very interesting process. And there was, in the very beginning, my editor sent out like all this information to me. And one of the things, she had a quote on there, and I don't remember who the quote was for, or excuse me, who the quote was from. But the quote was, books aren't written, they are rewritten. And I think that is so true, just from looking at the process that Annabelle of Anchony, Burdens of the Mind, has gone through. And now, with it being republished through Marian Press, I had another editor go through it, and he was like, well, here are the plot pitfalls I see. And so I changed it again, certain aspects of it, so that those pitfalls are addressed. And so it's a very interesting process. So as I've said, when I started writing the story, I was just writing it for myself. So I didn't care about the details, which are basically like the plot. So after I had signed with the Vanity Press, I'm like, this is kind of important. I should probably check on some of these things. So like one thing I was doing was I was trying to find out about the sacraments and see how they were different. If they did differ from today. And so anyway, I was talking to a priest, and he was like, well, what time frame does this take place? And I'm like, oh, it's medieval times, because I knew it had to be a time when there wasn't radio, there wasn't helicopters or anything, so that Annabelle could easily be found on the Forbidden Island. So I had picked in my mind medieval times, but that's all I had. So here, Father Schaefer was asking me, what century is it? And I was like, it's medieval times, and he's like, but what century? And I was just kind of like, I don't know. He's like, it should be the 13th century. That was a really good year, or really good century, not a year, a century. And then I looked into it, and it really is like that was a century of a whole lot of really good saints, like St. Francis of Assisi, St. Clare, St. Thomas Aquinas. So a whole lot more than that, but that just right off the top of my head, those three. So I was like, okay, I'll put it in the 13th century. Sure, why not? The priest told me to do it. But then other details, such as, were there fireplaces around at that time? Was there glass around in castles at that time? Like, I didn't know. So I had to actually do some research, and then I had to go back and change some stuff in my story because of that. So just FYI, so fireplaces, the wealthy could afford um, fireplaces. So castles had fireplaces for the most part, but the wattle and daub homes didn't. They had fire pits, and then they'd have to have a hole in the roof or somewhere up there for the smoke to get out. And then as far as the glass goes, they had very crude glass that kind of had a greenish tint to it, but there was some glass around, and again for the wealthy. And then some homes would have like stretched animal horns, I believe it's what it was. And so they would put it over the window so it would let light in, but it would stop the rain and the wind from coming in. So they couldn't actually see out of the window through these things, but it let light in. So small details like that. And I had to go back and like change it once again, once I was to the point where it's like, okay, if I'm going to publish this, then I need to actually look at this. So again, more editing on my part. So another thing is with the words. So, and this is kind of my trouble now with when I'm going back and re-editing all of my books. So in the first book, I didn't really pay much attention to the words. There were some words that the editor caught, and she's like, don't use this word. That word wasn't around, such as okay, hello even. She didn't tell me about hello, but I later realized that hello wasn't even around. And so to figure out what was around at that time, I used dictionary.com. So you go to dictionary.com and scroll down into the origin of the word. So what I've tried to do now is to only use words that had their origins in the 13th century or before. So, and if it says like 1275 to 13 something, I take it. I'm like, okay, there's a 12 in there. It's 13th century, give myself a little bit more room, a more variety of words, because let me tell you what, it is hard. It is so hard having to go back and change words or find a way for them to say something and still have the same meaning, but not use the words that didn't have their origins in the 13th century. So, like the word happen, just, they weren't around. So, like, those are words that we use all the time, just speaking. See it? So, it was a lot of work. So, basically, when I first did the Annabelle of Anchony, Burdens of the Mind, the first book, I wasn't really paying any attention to that. Through the second one, I started, it was probably maybe like halfway through the second or on the third. I can't really remember when I started to be like, okay, let's use dictionary.com and look up the origins of the words. But when I started to do that, I wasn't as strict as I'm being now. So what I mean is that if I had a word I was trying to say, then I would try to find words that were close to it, that were synonyms, and then I would choose whichever one was closest to having its origins in the 13th century. So that worked for what I was doing then, but now I'm being kind of a stickler for myself and be like, no, it has to be in the 13th century. So it is proving to be, it's kind of a nightmare at times, especially when there's a lot of dialogue, because I do it when what the characters are saying or what they are thinking, but not in like the regular text or the regular narrative. I use whatever words I want there. So for example, the word royal also wasn't around, so but sovereign was. So if you look in the updated version that's going to come out in Marian Press and you're like, why are they saying this word sovereign instead of royal. Well, that's why. It's because the word royal was not around. And if you notice, a lot of what came to pass, that is what I kind of have to say for what happened, because the word happened was not around. So that in itself is kind of a difficulty, but I'm getting to the point where I can kind of, for some things, I'm like, no, that word's not around, and I know that I need to change it. I don't even have to look at dictionary.com for some of the words any longer, because I have looked at it so many times. I'm like, no, that's not around. Like for allegiance, I'll have to do fealty. Uh, anyway, words like that. So that is a difficulty, but I'm pressing on. I'm moving forward. So there that is. So in all honesty, with the first book, the second book, the third book, like, I didn't think of myself as a writer. I thought of myself as a storyteller. And going back and reading these papers, what I wrote, I see why. And honestly, when I won the CALA, the Catholic Arts and Letters Award in 2013 for this book, this book won it. I was like, even then, I was like, okay, I won an award for writing, but am I really a writer? Like, I didn't feel like I was a writer. I felt like I was a storyteller, definitely a storyteller. But the writing, I just felt like I wasn't, I'm like, well, what is a good writer? And so going back and reading, and honestly, when I would work on my other books, I would go back and I would reread these books. And when I would read this book, it would make me cringe, because the sentence structure was like all the same. Like, every sentence seemed like it had the same sentence structure, especially in the first part of the book when Annabelle is growing up on the island. It's kind of like she and I grew up together. I grew as a writer as she grew up as a character. So we kind of grew up together in that sense. But yeah, the first part of the book, when I read that, it makes me cringe, because the sentence structure was like all the same. It didn't vary at all. And going back and reading these papers that I hand wrote, it's even worse. It's terrible. I'm going to give you an example here. And this, I don't know. I don't think it. I don't even know what part it is in here, because the way I would write with these papers is I would write with whatever I had in front of me. And so, like, this part might go with this part, and because I just didn't have one of them at the time. And so anyway, it's very, you can't quite follow it all. And even to this day, sometimes when I write one scene, and then I will put some kind of notation and then do another scene that are not in any way connected, but it's just what I'm thinking about at the time. And so I'll do it that way. So I end up with like random scenes everywhere, every which way. And I have to go and figure out where they belong and that kind of stuff when I'm typing it. So anyway, so I wanted to read this and just to show you what I'm talking about here. Nicholas slowly rode Cinnamon. So just FYI, Cinny, his horse Cinny, that stands for cinnamon. So I changed it in the actual book, but it stands for cinnamon. So that's why she's red. So Nicholas slowly rode Cinnamon into the castle barn. They were both relieved when they were welcomed by the cool dimness. A sigh was released as Nicholas was grateful for the drop in temperature. And just like the amount of passive voice, and it just, oh my gosh, it makes me cringe. So I think after writing, honestly, I'm working on Annabelle's 5th book right now. I think I'm finally getting to the point where I can say, yes, I'm actually a writer. Like, I have a variety of, I use a variety of sentence structure, and passive versus active, like I use it intentionally, you know, that way. Whatever I do it, I'm doing it intentionally and not just because that's the only way I know how to write it, you know. So I feel like I'm actually more of a writer now. But it took me 4 or 5 books to get there. So, you know, if you are trying to write your first novel, just keep writing. Just keep chugging at it and do it for yourself. And if something comes about, I mean, I would never start a book with the intention of I'm going to sell this. No, this is going to get published. Because I think that is the wrong intention. Like that it's the wrong intention. I think you need to start with you're doing it for yourself. Um, and even where I do it to evangelize, yeah, I'm doing it to evangelize, but I'm evangelizing myself first. And only if I deem it's good enough will I attempt to share it with the world. But I'm doing it for myself at first, you know, because it's a story that I want to write. So I kind of got tired of all the loose leaf papers and it just being kind of scattered this way and that. So I started using actual like composition books. So these are all that are like completely filled that I have used throughout my books. And I wanted to show you that this is the one I am currently working on, currently writing in, I should say. So generally what happens is when I start working on a book, I will start handwriting it, even to this day, because usually sometimes I go out into nature, and I live down in the Ozarks, and so there's a lot of places, parks, and that, you know, really peaceful places that I can go sit out in nature and try to be inspired by. So to be able to just take a notebook and write some notes down and or start writing scenes, start writing dialogue, stuff like that. It's really good to be able to have something that you can just hold. So I generally start off with the notebook, and then also I use it at night too. If I'm when I'm going to bed and I think of something, then I'll just like jot it down in here so that I don't forget it. Though sometimes I go with the thought that, well, if I don't remember it, it's not good enough. Like if it's not memorable enough, then it's doesn't belong in the story or something. But generally, I try to keep it next to my bed so that I can write stuff down. And I don't just use this for Annabelle's book. So I'm working on other stories, and so, but I want to stay in the same notebook. So this is how crazy I am. So, so I'll start a book here, okay, and that's as far as I've gotten so far. So I think this is all Annabelle's story, but some of them are from actually, I wrote some like new scenes for some of the other books, and so I wrote them in here, and I think I might have marked them for which book they are in. And then let's see, when I go back and I type it, I put a little check mark next to it so that I know I've kind of covered this area. And a lot of times, I will go back and I'll start typing what I wrote here, but then I'll change it, and sometimes it ends up completely different. And I don't really care, you know, that's just the process of how the story comes to be. So, okay, so like here's an example. So up to this point, up in here, it has been working on the 5th book, but here I am, I wrote a new scene from Annabelle of Anchony, Kingdom's Call. And I actually marked it there, so yay me for marking it for myself. So yeah, they're just kind of all there. And here I'm actually working on book 5, and I am at this point kind of trying to figure out things, and so I'm just not necessarily writing dialogue and that kind of stuff yet, but trying to, in my mind, kind of get an outline, because it does help at this point, because the plot there's so many different plot lines going on that I kind of need it at this point. Hence also the board that I've got. If you watched my videos on the poster board that I made to help me with my organization of my my characters, and just trying to figure out what's going on, to remember the characters' names and the city names and all that kind of stuff, and the plot points that I have not completely been addressed yet. All that. So that's needed for that. But then I wanted to show you. So then in the back here, so I've got. Let's see here. This is, what is this from? This is from a different story. And then, and that is, so what I do is I start here and then I write this direction. And then what I do is when I have another story in mind, which is what this is yet another story, I flip it around. And so now I'm writing on it upside down and I'm writing this way. So my notebooks end up very odd looking because they've got words going this way and that, and sometimes I even do start to write it in the margins too, as if I can get it in there somewhere. So yeah, kind of a mess, but at this point I guess it's working for me. So but it does come to a certain point where I stop writing in the notebook and I just do it in just in the computer. And so all the editing and stuff takes place in there. And even to this day, sometimes there are scenes that I make that don't end up in the final story, but I still like them. I don't have the heart to just delete them, or I'm like, oh well, I can't really use this in this book, so maybe I will save it for the next time. So then I start a file of like unused from this book, and then I will copy and paste. So from one document into the other. So I still have that in case I want to use it in the next book, So that's kind of my process. So I wanted to kind of just give some encouragement to anybody out there that might be looking, like, oh, I have a story in mind. And maybe you're getting very frustrated because you can't quite get it together. But so 5 years, I was working on Annabelle's story for 5 years before the first book came out, and even still, like, is being re-released and it's re-edited. So I've even worked on it since then, right? So it's a process, and so I just want to encourage you to keep writing, but don't be so like, oh, I have to get this published. Remember, books aren't written, they're rewritten. All right, well, if you guys have any questions for me, put them in the comments. You can like, subscribe, share, and you guys have a blessed day.